So just a little outline what I'm going to talk about. So briefly talk about the motivation, because you probably all know what the motivation is, so I don't need to spend that much time on it. I'm going to talk about and then a little bit of some literature on unemployment in CGE models or AGE models. Spend a lot of time on how are we going to introduce or incorporate this frictional unemployment in the GTAP model. What are the key assumptions that we're going to that I've made, and we can talk about whether you like those or not. And then we're going to go through an example simulation. So we're going to compare the standard GTAP model with, I guess, what I call GTAP labor, for a better name for now. And so what it's going to be is, so in both models, we're going to look at the impacts of a 25% increase in U.S. tariffs on steel and aluminum. So we're going to have a sector in these models called metals, so it's ferrous metals and non-ferrous metals. And then just kind of see how those two models are going to differ from that common experiment. And then we'll just wrap up with some summary and some future considerations. Okay. So again, you guys all know, AG models assume full employment, right? And it's because originally the idea was, well, the length of run is medium to long term, so you have a policy shock. The length of run is long enough that you come back to full employment, right? So obviously now with things like the Great Recession, FTAs, some questions. Well, do we get back to the original level of full employment, right? And how long does it really take? I mean, does it take longer than a sort of medium run sort of consideration? Okay. So as far as the literature, there's not a whole lot out there that incorporates some sort of unemployment into an AG model. So it's small but emerging. So probably the first one that I could think of anyway was some of the work that Peter Dixon and Maureen Rimmer did on the Monash model, right? So that was a sticky wage sort of specification where you got downward rigidity in the wage rate due to some institutions like labor unions or something else that makes that wage rate downward rigid. And so what creates the unemployment, right? So, I mean, that's okay in regions that might have a lot of labor unions, right? But for the U.S., not so much anymore, right? Because labor union memberships have been going down for a long time. So, a more recent sort of alternative is to incorporate some of the work on frictional unemployment that uses some sort of job search model. And so the idea is that if you're unemployed, you have to search for a job, right? You have to go to an interview, right? And then on the converse side is that firms have to search too, right? They have to look for people to interview and decide who they're going to hire, right? And that takes real resources at the firm level. Okay? So we're going to incorporate this sort of job search sort of friction into the GTAP model. And I guess the paper that I'm going to extensively use, and I don't remember where it just got published last year, but it's in the paper that I said. So Halstead and Williams is going to be the main sort of reference, and they reference probably the main kind of job search sort of paper that, or sort of literature that they reference. One of the key ones is Scheimer in 2010. Okay? So the advantage of this is that it's all micro foundation based, right? It's based upon some sort of search model. And then we're going to see is that with this approach, I can get into the model differences in labor turnover rates by industry. And for the US, I mean, I was shocked. I was like surprised at how large the labor turnover rate is in the US. And then there's a lot of variability between industries as well. And I have a graph, we'll show that in just a minute. So we'll be able to get that into this model. Okay? All right, so I want to talk about, well, how are we going to incorporate this? Well, so if you look at the work by Halstead and Williams, right, so what they use is this matching function. Okay? So let me stand back here in these one. So I got some matching functions. So J is going to be the industry. Now I've suppressed, I could also have subscripts for labor type. You can have differences between skilled and unskilled. And then you could let it buried across country too, but I didn't want to have all those subscripts to make it kind of messy. So you can think of this for a given industry, for a given labor type in a given region. So M is going to be the number of matches in that industry. Mu is going to be a matching efficiency parameter that we're going to calibrate eventually. So this term here is just really unemployment. So Hampstead and Williams, they normalize full employment to equal 1, and they normalize employment to be some fraction of that. So this is really just the rate, the level of unemployed individuals. This gamma is going to be a matching elasticity parameter that we're going to have to choose to calibrate this function. The R's here are going to be some recruitment effort by the industry. So what I'm going to do is that's going to be some sort of units of labor used in recruiting. And I'm going to keep the convention when I use units where 1 unit of labor is just $1 worth. Okay? And then the key thing here is you got the summation over K, so that's all the other industries or sectors within that region. All right, so this is your effort, and this is a total recruitment effort by every sector in that given region. So this has a couple properties. First, it's increasing in unemployment, right? So this gamma is usually positive. So if the unemployment rate goes up, right, it's easier to match, right? You can match, you get more matches for the same level of effort, right? And it's also increasing in your own level of recruitment. So the more effort you put into recruiting, the more matches that you're going to be able to make. And then conversely, if some other sectors increase their recruiting effort, right? Because you got a negative sign on that gamma, right? That means you'll have fewer matches unless you increase your recruiting effort as well. Okay? It also has constant return to scale in all these arguments. So if I double unemployment, I double all of the recruiting efforts, that means I'm going to double the number of matches. And because J, right, this K also includes J, there's decreasing returns to your own effort. So the more effort you put into it, you're getting diminishing number of, and the increase in the number of matches. Okay? For each sort of labor type, so skilled and unskilled labor, now there's going to be 4 different, what I call labor classes. So there's going to be an existing type of labor, both skilled and unskilled, matched, which I'm going to call a newly hired. There's some recruiters, and then there's going to be a pool of unmatched labor. So the unmatched labor you can think of, that's going to be the individuals who are current or not employed, and we're going to be drawing the matched labor from that pool. Okay? So this matched labor, what we're going to do is we're going to link that to the labor turnover information. So eventually we're going to see in a minute for the U.S., so I've gone in for the job opening and labor turnover survey from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. I'm using that sort of data to determine the level of matched labor in each industry. So based on their turnover rate, right, if you're going to maintain some level of employment, so if you have a 30% turnover rate, that means every period, right, you've got to hire 30% of your workers because you've got that many people turning over. Okay? So that's what's going to determine this level of matched labor. And then I'm going to make some assumptions about how much labor we need for recruiting to begin with. And then what's left then is going to be what I'm going to call existing labor. So that's going to be labor that doesn't turn over in a given period, right? They stay there the entire time. Okay? So in production, right, only the existing and the matched labor is going to be used to actually produce whatever product that industry is producing. The recruiters are just there to hire this level of matched labor, right? So they're not going to be used in production. The other thing that I've assumed is going to be a key assumption with the existing labor is that it's specific to each sector, okay? So that basically means I'm not letting people switch jobs, okay? So if you're part of the labor that doesn't turn over in a given period, right, you stay in that sector, okay? And so the implication there is going to be, right, when you have a sector-specific factor, right, the wage rates are going to differ between each sector now. to the extent that the elasticity is, there's going to be an elasticity of substitution of it between these. As long as that's finite, right, you're going to have some differences in the wage rates between sectors. So as the demand for labor goes up, say because you're increasing output, right, that's going to be affected on the wage rate for your existing labor rates. It's going to make that go up. Of course, it goes the other way. Production goes down, the demand for labor goes down.
It kind of makes sense that, I mean, if you look at a given sector and they're hiring, they're going great guns, often the new hires are getting hired at higher salaries than the existing workers, and this idea that everyone's paid the same for any given capability is probably not true. So this would reflect that. And the premium, I guess, would be.
Well, the premiums that you're going to see in a minute goes to the existing labor. So these matched labor rates, so since this pool of unmatched labor is available to every sector, right? So every industry is drawn out of this pool of unmatched labor. So there's a single wage rate.
The premium's going to the people already there.
Yes, that's what's going to happen. That's right. So, you know, the size of that again will depend upon what's the elasticity of substitution.
Is there a cost?
So
matched labor?
So for matched labor, right, the cost of the firm is going to be, well, what's the wage that you have to pay newly hired labor, right? And then it's going to be what's the cost of recruiting on a per unit or a per match basis. Okay, so there is, I mean, it's not just the wage rate, there is some additional cost, and whatever it costs you to recruit.
So for the unmatched, you said there is a pool of unmatched labor coming from different sectors?
There's just like in the U.S., there's just some pool of unmatched labor, skilled and unskilled, that any sector can draw from. So I mean, there's not like some sort of regional differences in anything like that. There's just one pool of unmatched labor.
Yeah, so probably that is a pool of different types of workers with different skills. If you want to match them.
Well, okay, so there is a pool of skilled and unskilled labor, right? I mean, they're not in the same pool, right? There are different. So I have a pool of unskilled labor that's not matched, and I have a pool of skilled labor that's not matched.
You could have as many pools as you had data on, right?
Well, so it's skilled and unskilled because, you know, I just went with the labor breakout that's in the GTAP database now, right?
So the point here, you have a doctor and you have an engineer. If you wanted to match a doctor to the engineer position, that's possible. And both of them are skilled.
You could make him a taxi driver though.
That's correct. Well, and it also depends on what you know, maybe you can sell a welder to be skilled as well too, right?
So I mean, there are, I think, Caitlin with the ITC has done a thing where they break out doctors or something. I mean, they have quite a refined set of labor categories, and this is rather than skilled, unskilled, you could have 20 categories there. If you believed that they were really distinct, it could.
I mean, so the thing there that would be a challenge, and we'll see in a minute, is that so the job opening and labor turnover survey does not distinguish between labor types. Okay, so it just gives you separation or turnover rates. You can see differences between kind of broad sectors, but there's no distinguish between different occupations or skilled, unskilled, or any sort of labor type. So somehow, I mean, you could just assume it's the same for all the labor types, right? But, you know, it's probably, so one of the things we'll see, like, go in here to think about the initial unemployment rates, right? I mean, there's probably differences in turnover rates and employment levels by some of these different occupations. So, I mean, to the extent that you get that data, right, you can do something maybe a little more detailed. Yeah.
So I have a different issue, and it's kind of my own personal defect, as I do a lot of dynamics. So I was have you thought a little bit about the steady state properties of this? I mean, so if there are wage differentials, if there are wage premia, are they, are they kind of set in stone, basically, or is there going to be some sort of convergent process in this model? The second question I had is there any limit on total employment? Getting back to the dynamics.
Let me ask you, so as far as the dynamics, the answer is no, because it took me a while just to get this to work. So no, I haven't got quite there yet, right? But I have thought about this whole thing about limits, right? So one of the things that I tried to play around with earlier was to set up some sort of complementarity. So when you got to some level close to full employment, right, it would start driving that wage up for the unmatched labor. But for whatever reason, apparently I haven't got that coded right yet, because when I have that in there, it blows up. So I haven't quite got that figured out yet. But eventually, I mean, that's one of the things that I want to do. Now, in this application, it doesn't really matter, because it's 2011, all the unemployment rates are high. So yeah, we're not even close to that. So it was nice that the base year made it so I didn't have to worry about that. But clearly now, right, you might have to worry about that sort of issue. And so, I mean, eventually that's one of the things I still want to work on, to get something like that in there. But that's not in there yet. Yeah.
Is there any mobility between skilled and unskilled labor classes?
No. So, so what I'm starting, so in the GTAP, we've got this pool of employment of skilled and unskilled. There's no sort of switching between.
So the taxi driver can't go to med school and, dang, tough world.
I'm harsh on that. Any other questions? All right. So now we've got this existing and matched, right? We need to modify our production structure just a little bit. So everything up here, right, I mean, that's just a standard GTAP structure. So now you've got one more CES mess down here, and so now there's some substitution possibilities between existing and matched. Okay? And so that's the elasticity substitution, so LS is just skilled. That's unskilled, you can allow those to differ between, skilled versus skilled. Okay. So obviously the bigger this is, right, if you went to infinity, right, you would be basically back to what we have now with full employment, right? Because, since this is variable, right, and this is fixed, it perfectly substitutes. You just got one labor market. So what we're going to see when we look at, I actually do some sensitivity a little bit later, is that the value of this parameter is going to be a key driver of the uncertainty in the model results for a lot of things. The exception being the changes in the level of unemployment level. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. But these are going to be key parameters. So initially, I'll talk about this in a minute. I mean, I've set these large enough, given this value of sigma VA, to make sure that these are actually substitutes and not complements. Yeah.
So you earlier mentioned that the recruiters does not cost within production, but they give income.
Yes. So, I mean, their job is just to recruit this matched labor.
So how that fits in the framework?
Well, so, I mean, it is, the household, right, the single household in each region, they have some level of skilled and unskilled labor, right? And it just depends upon where it's being used, right? So, they'll get labor income from all those uses. So if you're a recruiter in some industry, right, you're going to get the wage rate for the matched labor, right? I know how much that is. So that's just going to be part of household income.
Yeah, to me this means that there is a sector which is doing the matching, recruiter sector. You should have a balanced table in terms of oil. So
presumably it is like an activity, right? They're using workers and they're doing a service.
Well, now the other thing about the recruiters, right? Here's one thing that problems when trying to get this to work. So the recruiters are being pulled out of that unmatched pool. Okay. So initially I tried to pull them out of the existing labor force. I can talk about it later, but that caused problems. So all this the matched and the recruiters are all getting pulled out of the unmatched pool. And any period, or they're coming from that. So the firms can scale up or down the number of recruiters that they have, as well as the amount of matched labor that they need, depending upon what's happening to their output levels. Okay? Yeah.
When I'm employed, what does make me unemployed? What sort of?
Well, right now in this model, so you've got some initial level of people unemployed, right? What either makes that go up or down depends upon changes in production from the, changes in the demand for labor from the policy shock. Okay? So you think about in this tariff one, right? So what's going to happen is that it's going to have an adverse effect on manufacturing, right? And so manufacturing production goes down in the U.S. That means they're going to need fewer workers, right? And then so they need fewer matched labor, right? And so the level of employment is going to go down, and so that means unemployment is going to be going up from manufacturing, right? Because they're hiring fewer matched labor.
How does that speak to the importance of sigma ls and sigma lu to reduce unemployment? I think you mentioned earlier that when sigma is at the very lower tier or infinity, then they don't have any unemployment.
That probably would be the case.
So I want to, can you elaborate a little bit? How does that relate to the question I asked? What does make you unemployed?
Okay. Well, I guess I don't have a case where it's infinity, right? It's a finite value, so there will be unemployment.
How does driving it to an infinite value eliminate unemployment?
Well, because you're going to have a single wage rate, right, across all these industries.
So you just move to a place where
So
wage adjusts to the market.
Yeah. So now, well, that's a good point. I probably misstated that. I mean, there still could be unemployment, right? But you're going to get back to like a single wage rate, okay? Because if they're all at infinity in every sector, right, it's just going to look like a single labor market, then, right? But I suppose there still could be unemployment depending upon what happens to kind of the level of output in all these sectors after the shock. So there's you probably still could either get gains or decreases in unemployment, but you're going to have just like a single wage rate. Right?
Say there's a shock to a firm or a sector, then there are two margins for this sector or for this firm to decide. I can give lower wages to my labor and keep all labor I have had, or I can keep in the other extreme the wage as it was and lay off labor. I wanted to understand about the mechanism that is playing in that margin.
Okay, so let's see if I can answer that question. All right, so I'll just think about.
You go back to the steel industry.
Yeah, so all right, so you think about the metals, right? Well, I guess maybe we'll do manufacturing, so it goes down. So eventually we're going to see the U.S. manufacturing output goes down, right? So they're going to need less labor, depending upon substitution within value added and whatnot, right? You've got existing labor, it's fixed right there, right? So they're going to keep that labor, that can't move, right? And so the adjustment takes place within the matched labor. And then the number of recruiters as well too. So if you change the number of matched labor, you need fewer or more recruiters to hire those. So this adjustment is going to take place within the level of matched labor. Now the difference in the wage rates between the matched labor and the existing, once that sigma gets big, right, that gap is going to shrink. Okay, so what actually happens in manufacturing, we'll see in a little bit. So for unskilled labor, so their demand drops, right? So the wage rate for unskilled labor goes down, right? But it actually goes down a little bit more than matched labor, because matched labor is the national market, right? Whereas the existing unskilled labor in manufacture is sector specific. And so that actually they would actually want to have more existing labor, right? Because that's less expensive, right? And so then they end up hiring even fewer people because, you know, they'd rather have more matched labor, existing labor. So that probably puts a little more downward pressure on how many matches that they actually want to make, because existing labor is cheaper.
It'd be helpful when you go through your example to understand this better.
Okay. So just to give you a little idea of what the separation rates look like. So I got for the last 10 years that was available. So over here, so this is just a percentage. So total separation, or the separation rate, is both voluntary and involuntary separations divided by total employment. Okay, and this is for each month. So if you think about like a year, right, I mean, it's not quite just multiplying by 12, but I mean, that kind of gives you an idea of the range. Okay, so here is just for the US, you know, as a total, right? So the average separation rates have pretty much been averaging between 3 and 3.5% per month, right? So that's happening every month. So you can see within a year, right, you're getting, you know, 35, 40% turnover rate across all these sectors. Okay, so there's quite a bit of labor turnover in the U.S. labor markets. Now there's also a lot of variation between industries. So we'll start at ones that have the least amount, not quite the least amount, but this is durable goods manufacturing. So, you know, a little bit of variation. I mean, of course, it goes up 2009, the Great Recession, right? That's probably involuntary separations. But then it drops down to about 2%, okay, per month. So about a quarter of their employees get turned over, like in a given year.
But over a year period, it could be the same person.
Potentially.
You can imagine how
Right.
bringing in people and then laying them off, bringing them back on.
Hopefully it's not the same person.
Students,
Well, the problem there is, you know, I don't know that,
Yeah.
right? And, I mean, the key thing here is going to be, so the problem, go back to here, is we have something like this, right? So, if your employment goes down and you need to shed employees, right? You can only shed really as much matched labor as you're hiring, right? So if you have an industry with a low turnover rate, so it's like 90% or maybe a 10% turnover rate, right? Once you shed 10% of your employees, right, then you're hitting this level of existence, right? So you can't shed any more than 90%. And so that was one of my concerns when I was doing this, right? Well, am I going to run into this problem? Okay, so I started looking at this. So, I mean, even something like here, assuming that they're not hiring back the same person, right? I mean, you could have a 20% reduction in employment, right? And still not get to the level of existing labor, right? So you're not hitting that sort of payout, even on, you know, so there's actually like government, I can't remember the name in BLS, there's some sort of government sector that has a slightly lower turnover rate, but even that's between 1.5% and 2% a month. Okay, so some other ones that are low. So wholesale trade has some a relatively low turnover rate. Real estate looks kind of like the average for the U.S. And then retail trade's a little higher. And then the winners, as far as the turnover derby, is construction and accommodation and McDonald's. Okay, so I mean, look up here for food. Yeah, that's 6% a month. That's a lot.
And then you're already hiring the same person. Yeah.
So there is a fair amount of churn in the U.S. labor markets, and there's a lot of variability between sectors. Okay. All right. So I'll talk about how am I going to come up with these separation rates in my example. So eventually, in this simulation, I'm going to have 6 sectors. So food and agriculture, extraction, metals. So manufacturing is all the manufacturing other than metals, transportation, and services. Okay? All right. So this would be the separation rates. So I'm going to use what they were in 2011, right? Because that matches the base year of the GTAP database. So in that year, we took it over the entire year, the turnover rate for US, and it doesn't include farm, right? This is all non-farm sort of employment, because BLS doesn't have any information on farm employees, okay? Was 36.5%, okay? So to get the level of total matched labor in the US, so I take that 2365 and I multiply that by what's the units of labor that's in the GTAP database. So that'll tell me how much matched labor is. And then for these others, so again, there's no data on agriculture, but I lump food processing in there, and so that's part of non-durable manufacturing. So that a 30% turnover rate. So extraction, so the BLS has one, mining and logging, and so about 0.31 extraction rate. So for metals, that's durable manufacturing. And then what I did for the manufacturing sector is, so they split out durable and non-durable, but they also give you a composite manufacturing sector. So for total manufacturing in the US, it was 0.24 for the turnover rate. So given this, you know, this is just a residual to make the total turnover in all of manufacturing in these two sectors equal to 0.24. Okay, so this was the trade and transportation sectors, and then for services, it's just a residual. All right, so if I know the total number of matched labor from this number from the US, and I can compute it for all these sectors, right, then this total level of matched labor here is just a residual, right, to make this match. And then I can just divide by the units of labor, right, in services. And again, the BLS survey doesn't distinguish between skilled and unskilled, so I basically assume the same. The only reason why this is different, right, is because there are different levels of skilled labor, right? The levels here, initial are different than they are here, so I'm getting different total numbers of matched labor for skilled labor, and so this residual just turns to be a little bit different. Okay? Now, in the simulation, what I've done for the other regions, right, because there'll be two other regions in my simulation, the EU and the rest of the world. So I'm basically assuming these same separation rates, except for services, which is my residual in all those sectors. So these other regions are going to look like this, because I don't have any other information right now on separation rates other than for the US. Okay. All right, so now we need to incorporate labor supply into the GTAP preference structure, right? And so when I was thinking about that, I thought, well, it's probably best if I don't change the GTAP preference structure that much, because there are people who are already using the model. You don't want to change that structure that much. So what I did was, and like Halstead and Williams makes the same sort of assumption, is assume that consumption is separable from the supply of labor. Okay, so I'm going to have this additive function, right? So I'm going to add on, so you can think of this log C as this is just the utility from consumption in the GTAP model, you know, so private consumption, savings, government, household, there's just some utility level there. Then I'm going to add on to that these labor preferences, so the disutility of labor, right? And use a constant elasticity of supply function. So HU and HS are going to be the units of unskilled and skilled labor supplied by the household in each region. These rows are going to be related to the supply, labor supply elasticity. So 1 over rho is the labor supply elasticity, and then the size are going to be some labor disutility parameters that I calibrate such that, so we could take this function, right, we could do the first order conditions, I could derive the labor supply, right? I'm going to choose the size such that the labor being supplied in the GTAP database matches this optimal first order conditions here. Okay, so those sides are going to be calibrated. All right, so to get this matching function calibrated, I need to have information on the level of unemployment. Okay, so we're going to use, I'm going to use the US rates. I didn't check on the others. Again, I'm just trying to get this thing to work. So if you think about an unemployment rate, right, that's just the number of people who aren't employed but who are looking for a job, right, divided by the labor force participation, which is people who are employed plus people who are actively looking for work, right? So if you do a little bit of algebra, right, then you can say that the level of unemployment rate is equal to, so this is the unemployment rate, this ratio, and this is the level of people who are employed, okay? So in 2011, if you look at the US from the current population survey, the unemployment rate, the total rate across all types of labor, right, was about 9% in 2011 for most of the year, okay? So what I'm going to do then for the level of unemployment for total, right, so I got, again, some units of labor from the GTAP database. So this is 0.9 minus divided by, or 0.09 divided by 0.9, and then that's going to give me my total level of unemployment, okay?
So when you say unit of labor, what do you mean by that?
Come again?
When you say unit of labor, what
So I'm just assuming, so you've got some value numbers in the GTAP database,
value
right?
on it?
No, well, there's some labor value numbers in there, total value. You sum across all the uses, right? You can come up with what's the total value of unskilled labor used
That's
in all
value
these
added
sectors.
labor.
Yeah, and so then it's just, I assume that the wage rate's $1, and then my units are the value, you know, those values in there. Okay? Yeah.
Would it be an improvement if you use just employment in million, in people count, head count, because we also have it in GTAP instead of using values?
I didn't because eventually I have to create some new categories from the database for this model. And so I had to split, you know, I have to distinguish between existing and matched and recruitment labor. So, I mean, maybe if you want to get maybe like a head count, you know, maybe you can assume, you know, like a different wage rate, right? Something like a median wage or something like that, right? And then that would, or a median income for a person, right? There's something you could do, right, to get that back to maybe it looks like people. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, we have a head count in
Right.
database.
Okay, well, I guess
They may not be
I sort of forgot that was there.
If,
But then wages would be differentiated over sectors and countries and so on.
All right, so that's a total, but then we've got skilled and unskilled labor. So we know that there are differences in the unemployment rates between those two different types of labor. So I'm like, okay, well, I should probably try to at least have that difference to begin with. So what I ended up using was looking at data on unemployment rates by education level. And I know that's not a perfect sort of match, right? But at least kind of gives me, you know, maybe some idea about how those relative rates might change. And so these are just from the CPS, right? You know, what's the different levels of unemployment by these different levels of educational attainment. So obviously, the less educational attainment that you have, right, the higher the unemployment rate. So looking at that for this application, and particularly down here, right, and then of course, obviously you could have a high school degree. You might actually could be a skilled worker if you are a welder or something, right? So I assume that the skilled unemployment rate is 7%. The total in the U.S. is 9%, right? And then this just becomes a residual. You know, whatever it needs to be to make sure that the total is 9, the level of skill is 7. And then for the other regions, they have basically similar looking levels of unemployment initially. Okay. All right, I think this is the last. Yep. All right, so the last thing that we need to do then is to calibrate this matching function. Okay. So first is this matching elasticity parameter, this gamma. So there's a little discussion in Halstead and Williams that there's been some previous work in this area of frictional unemployment that has estimated that gamma to range from 0.3 to 0.75. Halstead and Williams assume 0.5, and this is going to be the base value that I'm going to use in my simulations. Now, I do used a little bit of sensitivity on this a little bit later, and we'll talk about its impacts. The next thing I need to assume, or what I do assume to get this calibrated is, well, how much initial labor is used in recruiting? Okay, so Halstead and Williams assume that 0.5 of 1% of all labor in each sector is used in recruiting. Initially, I used a little bit more because I was worried that I didn't want to drive that to zero at any time when I'm trying to get this model to work, because I didn't want it to blow up on me. So I made sure I was never going to get driven to zero, so I assumed a little bit more. You could do something a little bit different, obviously, at some point. Okay? And then the initial number of matches is coming from the turnover data. So it's a turnover rate times these initial units of labor from the GTAP database. And so then the only thing I don't know in that matching function is that mu, okay, that matching efficiency parameter. Okay? But an implication is going to be, if I assume that each sector has to use 1% of its labor to match, right, that means if you have a big turnover rate, this mu is going to be much bigger. Okay, so that's saying that implicitly that sectors that have to replace a lot of people, right, are more efficient at it than sectors that don't have to replace as many people. Okay, so this mu is going to vary between sectors depending upon what the turnover rate is. Okay, so that's, all right, so now we're done about, I guess, the matching functions. Any questions before we go on to the simulation?
So what's your market clearing condition for labor? In your CG?
Same, you know, it's just labor. So you've got a labor supply function now coming from the households,
Fine, I
right?
understand.
And then that has to equal the sum of all the labor uses.
Maybe
So,
if you follow the traditional market clearing condition
Mhm.
value base, and then in one point you match number of employees, number of workers somehow into this pool, then there is inconsistency, meaning that
well, so the existing labor rate is not mobile, right? It's sector specific, right? So I mean, the supply doesn't change, and so that demand is always going to equal that, right? To make sure that the supply is equal to demand, and so that wage rate, right, is going to move up and down to make sure that happens. And then, I guess, as far as the matched labor, right, so it's a national sort of demand, right, so you can sum up basically the differences in demand from all these different sectors, right, and then equate that to the supply of labor coming from the household.
So I understand totally. That's based on value, right? And then you assign those to the labor, number of persons.
I don't think they're based on value. He's thinking
No.
about, it's a quantity-based
quantity.
market clearing
It's an
condition.
index issue.
I would look at the paper, it's all Q's.
Yeah.
It's all Q's. Yeah.
And not the number of people employed.
Whether you measure it on an annual basis, an hourly basis, a weekly basis, or on a value basis, you get the same results. He's using a quantity index to find that the wage is just $1.
And initial period prices
At
don't
initial
change, so it's not a value. Anyway, maybe you can bilateral afterwards on that, yeah.
Okay, so just a little more detail on this simulation. So again, I got 6 industries. I'm going to have 3 regions: U.S., EU, rest of the world. I don't aggregate any of the primary factors. So you got land, labor, capital, skilled, and unskilled labor. All the parameters, all the common parameters are set to their default levels that are in the GTAP database. So I assume for the labor supply elasticities are 1. So these is similar to what Halstead and Williams assume. And then the elasticity substitution between matched and existing is 2.5. Again, I wanted to get it big enough right? So I made sure that existing and matched labor are going to be substitutes. So I wanted it bigger than whatever sigma BA was. Okay.
And the labor supply elasticity, that strikes me as large. Wages go up by 10%, you supply 10% more labor, is that right?
That's right.
I'm not a labor economist. Does anyone study labor supply elasticity?
See that it is usually less than one.
Okay.
So actually, when I did this sensitivity, right? So I set the endpoints on this, on that uniform distribution. Well, of this to plus or minus 50%. So the endpoints would be 0.5 and 1.5. So actually, the thing that the results that we see in that are most sensitive to that labor supply elasticity is the change in the unemployment level. Yeah, it doesn't, as far as some of the wage rates and prices and output levels, that's more sensitive to this. All right.
Can I rephrase my earlier question? I want to understand about the existing labor, whether that is, you mentioned that there is a specific factor existing. Is it exogenously given in the model, or it is endogenous?
It's going to be exogenous. So
So if it is exogenous, then is it the case that we are putting a bound, maybe an upper bound,
Yes.
on the unemployment rate?
well, you're kind of putting a lower bound on what the employment's going to be, right? Because they're always going to keep whatever level of existing labor is in there initially, right? Your employment's not going to drop
Well,
below
that's
that.
up-
Which is an upper
on-
bound on unemployment, lower
Okay.
bound on, yeah.
Okay, so the application is right for cases that we expect unemployment to go down.
Mhm. Well, so what's helpful, again, on this is just because we've got, these fairly large turnover rates coming from in the U.S. market, right? And so, if you're turning over 30% of your employees every year, right? I mean, there's probably not a lot of policy shocks that's going to give you a 30% decrease or drop in employment, right? So you're probably, that's what I was worried about this whole thing, about making that assumption. Was I going to get to a point where I was going to drive the demand for labor in the sector down low enough that I'm going to hit that lower bound, right, or the upper bound on unemployment, right? So if you have enough churn, right, in a labor market, you're probably not going to get there. Now, perhaps we talk about Dominique, if you're looking at sort of, a more longer sort of dynamic model, then perhaps then you probably may have to start worrying about that a little bit more. Okay, but at least in the static one, right, especially this shock, I don't have a big enough shock, right, where that's gonna cause a problem. But if I had sectors that only had 10% labor turnover, then that would be a problem.
This labor supply elasticity is for these guys, unemployed guys who are desperate to find a job. Maybe that isn't too high.
Like I said, they had a little discussion in Halfton and Wales. I'm not a labor person either, so they used 1%, and so that's what I ended up using.
You're saying that because these are this is the matched labor, really. Effectively, we're talking about matched labor because the other guys are specific.
They're exogenous.
But you can expand your effort.
The labor supply is totally new, right?
Yeah.
It's not just the matched or unmatched, it's everything.
Right.
Total labor supply, but in effect, over this period of simulation, 70% is tied up.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions?
When you say total supply of labor, including those who do not have job,
Who are actively looking for jobs.
Maybe you elaborate on that. The supply function of the utility function you showed us. Is it for everybody in the economy, or just for matched?
Well, it's just going to be, It's for the regional household, right?
It's for everybody.
I guess I would say, it's for people who are looking for, so to get the household to supply more labor, right, the wage rate is gonna have to go up, right? So, I guess this is for people who would be actively participating in the labor force, I guess.
That per capita household is a representative household in a way it has to represent everyone. Everyone in the economy who's consuming. In a way, it's a blend between the desperate person you were talking about and the person who's satisfied with the steel mill because they got the tariffs and their wages are going up.
So, I mean, if you have some policy thing, where you're driving employment up, right, there's gotta be something that's going to make that wage, the wage is gonna have to go up for those people, right? So, I mean, this is just basically, like Tom said, it's determining, right? So if the demand overall, if employment's going up, right, how does the wage rate for this mass labor gonna change? And so this is just really, so if labor demand goes up by 1%, right, the wage rate has to go up by 1% to get people to supply more labor.
You should think about very big household. Part of it is unemployed, part of it is high skill, and part of it is low skill. This is how it works.
Now you ask me questions I haven't thought about before.
That's why you give seminars.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, when you got one representative household, you got a little bit of everything, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm not trying to model like a household that's employed, a household that's not. I mean, I think actually Halfstead and William had some discussion on trying to switch, if people became employed, right, that had, might have some differential effects, right? I didn't try to do that. Yes.
So, when you run the model, percentage change in the match labor always should be greater than 0.
No,
If it can be negative, this means that
they're
labor will be employed from that sector.
They're not employing as much match labor, that's correct.
So that's fired.
Unemployment rate goes up.
Yes,
That means someone is fired.
that's correct.
So, but because of that, then the limit that you mentioned did not apply. The boundary that you mentioned.
So my understanding is that the application is right for cases where unemployment goes down.
No, but it can go up. If that can be negative.
It can go up.
In fact, in the application,
It does go up. Why don't you go through your application?
Well, just while we're on the question of utility function, so I wasn't convinced about this representative house. Because I know it's a national, but for me, if you want to go to micro theory, I think it's better to split household into skilled and unskilled. But then you go away a little bit from the GTAP. There's more work involved. So I understand why you did that. So you could just posit a supply function without providing a micro theoretical justification for it. So, but the other question I had, you could ignore it. You kind of ignore the utility formulation in the GTAP model. I was wondering whether you thought about the welfare decomposition and how that was going to be impacted.
Well, the reason why I thought that you wanted to put that in there, because if you assume there's some sort of disutility from labor, right? So then if you're supplying more labor, right, that's going to be a negative utility, right? And so I at least want to try to capture that when we started to try to compute the equivalent variation, right? But conversely, right, well, it's not quite the same, right? If you get laid off, right? So we're going to see in a minute when I do some ED calculations, right? If unemployment goes up, right, there's less disutility from labor in the household. So that actually offsets some of the decrease in reduction in utility from consumption, consumption loss. Right, but I thought, I thought it would be odd if I didn't try to at least somewhat account for that.
definitely go through the application.
All right, so again, we're gonna have a 25% increase in the US tariff rates on metal products, so steel and aluminum. Right, so the story here, regardless of what model you use, is that so the imported products become more expensive, right? So steel and aluminum is basically an intermediate input. So US firms are gonna substitute domestic metal from imported metal. That's gonna increase the demand for US metal products domestically. So the price is going to go up for US metal. That means anybody that uses it as an intermediate input, their cost of production is going to go up. It's mainly manufacturing that's the big user of metal, right? So we're going to see the prices of US manufacturing go up relative to manufacturing in the other sectors, right? So then that's going to cause domestically US firms to substitute to the imported manufactured products, also consumers, right, because there is some direct sales to consumers. And it's going to mean a reduction in US exports. So production of manufacturing in the US is going to go down. Okay? And that doesn't matter whether you use a standard GTAP model or one with unemployment, you get the same general resource. The magnitudes are what's going to be different. Okay? All right, so this is just to go through what the standard GTAP model is going to give us. So, we're on time here. I should get through. So the price of metals goes up by 2.25%. The price of US manufacturing goes up by 0.3. Right. So again, this is because metals are more expensive as an intermediate input. And it does have a little impact on the primary factors of input up land and natural resources. But so what's happening here? So we'll see in the next slide. So metals production goes up, right? So they need more land, labor, and capital, right? But we're going to see that manufacturing production goes down because manufacturing is such a much bigger sector than metals, right? Overall, there's really a decrease or a downward pressure, right, on the use of labor and capital, and that drives their prices down.
So that's with the full employment assumption.
Mm-hmm.
Full employment assumption.
And then, so these are the changes in the levels of output. Really for this, these are the two ones that are for the GTAP, standard GTAP model that's most important. So about 12% increase in output of metals, mainly from domestic demand. We actually export less metals, not surprisingly. And manufacturing is decreases split between domestic and exports, and obviously no impact on the aggregate supply. Okay, so now I want to think about what's going on with this labor model. Okay. So the first thing that I notice is that there's a much larger increase in the price of US metal, so a 2 percentage points. So why is that? I'm sorry, I have to flip between these. I couldn't figure out how to keep all these on one slide. So what's happening is, so you've got these specific labors, so skilled and unskilled, right? So this is for unskilled, but the results look almost the same if I put up a slide on skilled labor. So you've got this existing labor in metals that's specific. So they want to demand more labor, right? So that's going to drive up the wage rate for existing labor in metals. And so in this case, the wage rate goes up by 9.5%. Okay? And the composite wage, so this is between matched and existing labor, goes up by 7% relative to, a 0.1% drop in the existing GTAP model, right? So labor is more expensive, okay? And so, oops, wrong way. And so like 80% of this difference is because of that, okay? The other 20% is from own use, right? So the price of metals go up, that increases their cost of production. So this is mainly a story because existing labor is sector specific. That's really what's driving that higher price increase. And you get the same story, except, the opposite direction for manufacturing. So manufacturing's output drops, so their demand for labor goes down a little bit, and that means their demand for existing labor drops, that means that the wage rate for existing labor in manufacturing drops by more than, so right here, so by basically 0.75%. So it actually drops a little bit more than what the matched labor does. So you get a little, so now you've got labor costs going down by a little bit more than what they did here. So that's what you're getting, those drops. Okay? Let's see what else I want to talk about in here. So these are the wage rates for the matched labor. So again, this is a U.S. market, so they're fairly similar to what we got in the GTAP, standard GTAP model. So these are just the composite wage rates, right, or factor prices. So this would just be an average of the existing and the matched labor across all the sectors. So you get a little bit larger decreases in these wage rates because that's any industry, right, that reduces output by a little bit is driving that wage rate for existing labor down more than for this matched labor. Okay. So as far as so that's what's going on there. So as far as like output, so because since the price of metals is higher in the labor model than it was in the standard GTAP model, then you're going to have less substitution in the U.S. towards domestic metals because that gap between the imported price with the tariff rate and the U.S. price is small. That wedge is small, right? So you're not going to get as much substitution effect going on domestically, and then you're exporting even less than you were before, and so the production level goes up by a smaller amount. Okay? You get a little bit of difference for manufacturing. Their price doesn't go up as much now as it was before. So, and when I did the decomposition, what actually is happening is that there's the loss in exports isn't quite as great, and that's translating into a smaller drop in production for manufacturing. Now, the reason why I had these other sectors in here before, right? These aren't big changes, right? But when you go, like we had some small changes over here in the GTAP labor model, right? So we're going for a small positive to a small negative and a little bit bigger negative for services, right? But since services is such a big sector in the U.S. economy, right? They use a lot of labor, right? And so that's going to have a fairly large impact on unemployment, right? If you have even a small change in services, right? Just because they use so much labor, okay? And so what's going on in services? So you got a smaller increase in metals production, right? There is some intermediate demand for services by the metals industry. Obviously, that's not as large as it was before. Let's see what else. So there's also a little bit of services that's going into this investment good. That was sort of interesting in the GTAP database. And we get a little bit larger drop in investment production in the U.S. And it's going to be an income, at least what I think is an income story. So what's happening, the U.S. income is actually going to drop a little more, well, 0.2% compared to almost no change in the standard GTAP model. And it's because the wages have gone down a little bit more, right? But now the aggregate supply of skilled and unskilled labor is dropping. So you've got less labor being supplied and it's being paid a lower wage rate. So income goes down. So the demand for savings, right, goes down a little bit. So that's going to affect the level of investment good. There's also gets, run back into these other products.
There's another channel there. The replacement cost of capital is going up because there's a lot of work. So the rate of return, the perceived rate of return in the United States is going to go down, so there'll be less inflow in the United States as well.
All right. So we're seeing this aggregate supply of labor go down. So we can look at where is it, why is that happening by industry. I didn't put all all 6 up here, I put the ones that had the biggest sort of changes. Right, so this is the changes in employment by sector. And again, so these units, right, it's just $1 worth of labor, so that's why these numbers are so big. So if you think about metals, right, they want to expand production. They're hiring more, so they have to hire more matched labor, right, because the existing labor is fixed. They also need to have more recruiters, right, because they're hiring more. So employment in metals in unskilled labor is going up, right? However, for manufacturing, right, the demand for labor is going down, right? They need less matched labor, right? So now they're actually shedding. They're not hiring as much matched labor because they're not hiring as much matched labor, right? They need less recruiters. So so this is kind of a kicker down here as far as employment, right? You know, once you start dropping how many new hires or matched labor that you need, right? You also need fewer recruiters, so that gives you a little extra kicker. Plus also what's going down in here is when the unemployment rate goes up, it's easier to match, right? So you need even fewer recruiters. Okay, so that's getting fed back in here. All right, the same thing for services, right? But since manufacturing and services, right, they use so much more labor than metals, right? The drop in their employment offsets the gain in metals. Right, not surprising. Okay.
Unemployment level, okay, sorry, go ahead.
So, every some of recruiters change in the unskilled labor. You do not measure the total change. Is there...
Well, that's because I'm missing a couple sectors. So there's 3 other sectors in here that I didn't put on, just because the slide already has too many numbers.
Can you interpret the unemployment level? That's a percent change?
That's a percent change.
In the unemployment level.
So if you want to compute
1% more people unemployed.
So if you would compute the implied unemployment rate, so the unemployment rate would go up by 0.1 percentage points. Okay. So this was like 11.8. Initially, it went up to 11.9%. Okay. So this is just, you've got some pool of unemployed people to begin with, right? Or some level, right? So the initial unemployed, right, is the pool of unmatched labor subtracting off the initial match and the initial level of labor recruiters. That gives you the level of unemployed. So that number went up by about 1%, 0.8%. All right. Little bigger changes in skilled labor, and that's because services, big sector, they use a lot more skilled labor than like metals. And so you're getting a little bigger effects on skilled labor. So unemployment of skilled labor is going up by 1.5%. So impacts on income and EV. I mean, so this is the standard GTAP model, so this tariff really doesn't do much as far as impact on U.S. income. The equivalent variation is, minus 202 million, so it's a pretty small impact. In the labor model, there's a much bigger impact on income, right, because there's more unemployment, right? So income's dropping, labor income's dropping. There are more people unemployed. Okay. As far as utility, right? So I did the decomposition. So here's the change in consumption. And that's offset a little bit because there's less labor, just utility, because less people are employed. And then, but it's it looks like it's a small number, right? But you multiply that by however many $1 trillion of U.S. GDP, right? So you get about a $5 billion loss in EVs compared to only a $202 million loss in the standard GTAP model. So you are getting some sizable differences in equivalent variation. And then the last thing, so I did some sensitivity on labor supply, elasticity of substitution between matched and existing, and then that gamma, that matching efficiency, that matching supply parameter. Okay. So what I did there was so the endpoints on both of those was plus or minus 50%, right? And I varied everything jointly. I mean, I didn't allow different sectors to have differential values for those parameters, because right now so gamma's the same for every sector in every region. Okay, so when I vary it, it's still the same for every region and every sector. The labor supply elasticity was the same across all the regions. So when I vary that, it's still the same. If I just varied it, it's still the same number across all the regions, right? Because I didn't really know how to vary that. Now, if I let it vary differentially, right, it would be a lot different than a case simulation. Okay? So I'm going to break this down on 3 different types of results. So as far as the impact on the level of market price and output of U.S. metals, there's some uncertainty, right? But if you look at the standard deviations from the mean or the base value, they're less than 1/10 of a value, at 1/10 of the mean. And most of this uncertainty is being driven by the elasticity of substitution between existing and match. I mean, that's what's causing this uncertainty. If you go down here for labor use, there's more uncertainty now. Okay, so now it's down to the standard deviation is down to about 1/5 of the mean. And again, the elasticity of substitution between existing and matched labor is what's driving that. And then for the unemployment level, it's still about 1/5. The standard deviation is about 1/5 of the mean value. But now, instead of the elasticity of substitution, what's driving this is the labor supply elasticity and that gamma. They have about the same impact on driving this uncertainty. Okay? All right. Have a little bit of time left. Okay, so again, I guess just to summarize them, so I guess what I tried to do, I guess in this work is to incorporate job restrictions into the standard GTAP model. So we did an illustration on how the tariffs on an intermediate input can actually reduce employment in the U.S. And I guess one of the questions going forward, at least I had initially, is, to what degree are we going to find similar sorts of data in other regions, right? Because it's just the U.S., right? I'm assuming these other regions look like the U.S. Okay? So how different is these labor turnover rates in other regions? I mean that's really the key. There's some, can we get different unemployment rates by skilled and unskilled in these other regions? But that's kind of the key sort of thing. All right, and then I already talked about earlier. I want to get some sort of, when you get close to full employment, right? Let's kind of make this wage rate for the new matched labor more sensitive to that, right? Because I think that's eventually what you want if you're starting from a full employment initial equilibrium. I just haven't gotten there yet. That's something that I need to add. Okay.
I think it's really interesting how you've been able to build in some more detailed labor market information. And even without the rest of the world appropriately characterized, I can see this being very appealing for people at the ITC or something like that who are worried about labor markets. The one thing that's bothering me right now is what happens, who's getting these rents, what happens when the industry expands. So those rents are going to the workers now, not to the owners of capital. So I guess you need to add some specificity on the capital side to get that. I mean, is that plausible that the workers, the existing workers in the steel industry are the real beneficiaries? I mean, the incident, it's all about this incidence and who's hurt and who's not. Are we getting the right people hurt? So that question, that's the thing that goes in the opposite direction from my initial idea I threw out, that if they need to expand, they're going to have to offer the new workers more to get them in. And you're saying, no, they get less. The existing wages go up immediately. So is that the way it works? is that grossly misleading? Is it reasonable? I mean, I think the sector specificity, particularly in a short run model, is really needed. And I think I've indicated that to you in my email, is needed in a lot of these models that have way too much supply response, and they tend to go off to corners. Yeah, that's the case with any kind of monopolistic competition model in this framework. Without some sector specificity, it's going to often specialize. So we need more sector specificity in these models. Are putting it in the right place.
Well, I guess, that means you change this value added. And if you're worried about capital, really capturing spreads, right? I mean, we need to change somehow that value added now. Because, as you got it now, right, you're going to have, some sort of substitution between all these parameters, right? All these different types of value added, right? But if it's really, the rents are all going to capital, then what does that imply about this production structure?
Well, or maybe it's more on the factor supply side, but the capital is sector specific too, in the short run, to some degree. That moves into your recursive kind of thing.
Yes, on the rest of the world, the rest of the world is largely the developing world, not the downplay OECD. I'm not sure this kind of institutional framework actually applies all that well to the developing world, where I think really the difference between formality and informality is probably the most characteristic view of the labor market in the rest of the world. And I'm not sure whether you could frame this really in that kind of, or maybe you could and just have much higher turnover.
Would the existing workers who can never be fired be the formal sector?
Yeah. Then you'd make that much smaller as a share, right? As formal employment tends to be fairly small.
Well, that's it, by varying that existing labor share,
Well,
vary the flexibility.
If you increase the turnover rates, right,
That's right.
you're going to drive down that share of existing labor.
Yeah.
No.
So when I look at the whole picture, at the end of the story, the difference between the new model and the old model is that we have exogenized the existing labor, right?
Only part.
The existing labor is
Oh,
exogenous.
the existing,
Right? That's exogenous.
Yeah.
And then we have a variable that actually can change positive or negative due to the requirement of the shop. Some sectors will require, some sectors will hire, right? So you just added one elasticity between the exogenous and the new one.
And the production structure, yeah.
So, and that substitution varies by sector, right?
It can.
That's-
Right now, it
It's
doesn't.
not, okay.
It
So,
can.
my suggestion is that, and then the other difference is that you have endogenous labor supply, right? So my suggestion is just add the endogenous labor supply to the old model and run it and see what's the difference between your model and this model, the old model and the new model. My suggestion is that they probably will show the same. If you just add the endogenous labor supply to the old model, will probably project the same thing that the new model will match. But that's just my suggestion.
Well, just to follow up on that, so you could do two things with the standard model, right? You could just make labor a sledge factor and look at the impact of that, or you could fix the real wage, which is what Farzad is suggesting, and then employment becomes endogenous and look at the impact of that.
Employment by sector is endogenous. The total is exogenous. So my assumption is if you make the old model with a endogenous land supply, probably will get the same results. But just, and in particular because you have the same elasticity on all sectors.
no, I mean, I think that the idea there is to reach back to some of this literature, what people have done, and do some comparisons. I think that would be interesting. Certainly is appealing that you're talking about things that people in the labor market think about. You know, gotta hire more people, is it a tight labor market or not? I mean, that's all very interesting. I think just the language, even if the results weren't any different, the language there, and the fact that, well, the employment rate is changing, I think. I mean, people know these things, and I think they found it very dissatisfying that we don't speak to them.
On a more technical, realm, I thought rather than having recruitment, I thought the recruitment function was a little bit of a kludge. I would just create a new activity. I think this goes along with Tom mentioned at the beginning. We just call it recruitment. It has a cost function. It could be a mix of skilled and unskilled workers and capital, and then and just treat that as just an additional activity.
You got to buy
And then,
services from.
and then you have to buy services. So there's a little bit of a calibration problem, but in terms of the modeling, pretty straightforward. Then you don't have to say, well, only unskilled workers are recruiting unskilled.
Yeah. Oh, that's right. Yeah, no, that's a very good point.
Yeah. I don't think it's going to change the results
Yeah.
dramatically. I think it's probably just going to clean.
We should let people go. Thanks for all your patience coming, and Everett's around. If anyone wants to